The moment the delicate lace veil slowly slipped from the bride's face, a silence so profound that it seemed time ceased to exist swept through the vast ballroom. The Duke, whom everyone had pitied for his impending marriage to the hideous heiress, stood frozen, unable to breathe. Glasses froze in mid-air, the musicians stopped playing, and dozens of people stared only at her. The woman, whom high society had called a monster for months, turned out to be so beautiful that even the most envious ladies involuntarily lowered their eyes. But the real shock lay ahead, for she was hiding more than just her face. Rain quietly pattered against the tall windows of the ancient Blackwood Palace as Duke Alexander Ravenhall reread the king's letter once again. Every line was formal, cold, and left no room for argument. He was ordered to marry Lady Eleanor Winterford, the sole heiress to a vast fortune that was destined to save several failing aristocratic families. This union was beneficial to the crown, beneficial to politics, and completely indifferent to the feelings of the two young people. But Alexandra was troubled by something entirely different. For the past few months, all of London had been talking about the future Duchess. Some claimed that a terrible illness left her face covered in hideous scars. Others swore she was so ugly that she never left the house of her ethereal veil. Still others claimed her own father had hidden his daughter for many years, fearing public ridicule. Gossip spread faster than the autumn wind blew leaves through the streets of the capital. The poor Duke was the subject of sighs from the ladies at tea. Such a handsome man, and yet he was forced to marry out of duty. He deserved a true beauty. Imagine waking up every morning next to a woman whose face you couldn't see. Each new remark irritated Alexander more than the last. Not because he believed the rumors, but because he hated people who judged a man they had never seen. His best friend, Viscount Henry Ashforth, chuckled one evening as Alexander stared silently into the fireplace. "You didn't even try to refuse. It wouldn't have changed anything, but at least you could have met her beforehand." Alexander shook his head slowly. "Her father declines all such requests." "Strange, don't you think?" "Very." Henry sipped his wine thoughtfully. "Either the rumors are true. He paused. Or someone is trying very hard to make us believe them." The words suddenly stuck in Alexander's head. Why had no one ever seen the girl's face? Why didn't she appear at balls? Why couldn't even artists paint her true portrait? There were no answers. Meanwhile, a completely different atmosphere reigned at Winterford Manor. Eleanor stood before a huge mirror, while a maid carefully fastened the last pearl buttons of her wedding dress. White silk lay across the floor, like water. Every fold of the fabric was created by the finest craftsmen in France. But the girl herself barely looked at her reflection. Her thoughts were far away. "My lady," the elderly maid Margaret said quietly. "Are you sure?" Eleanor smiled sadly. It was too late to doubt. "But if you show your face," she didn't finish. Eleanor understood perfectly well what the old woman wanted to say. For almost 10 years, her father had forbidden her to appear in public without a veil. Not because his daughter was ugly, quite the opposite. On the day she turned 16, the influential Duke of Norton had bluntly declared to her father during a reception, "If people saw such beauty, half the young aristocrats would forget politics, fortune, and family name. Everyone would think only of her." At first it sounded like a compliment, but very soon it became a curse. Every man was eager to meet Eleanor. Every family tried to secure her engagement. Some were prepared to resort to blackmail, others to crime. Once unknown persons even tried to kidnap the girl on her way to church. After this incident, her father completely closed the estate to guests. And then the first rumors surfaced that the heiress was gravely ill. A week later, someone added a story about terrible scars. Within a month, all of London considered her ugly. That's when her father suddenly stopped denying the rumors. He realized something simple. People had stopped being interested in a girl they considered ugly. For the first time in years, Eleanor could stroll peacefully through the garden, albeit with her face hidden. But the freedom proved deceptive. Now no one wanted to see her as a person. Everyone discussed only her appearance, which supposedly didn't exist. She slowly ran her fingers over her thin white veil. "Funny," she whispered. "People can hate a face they've never seen." Margaret looked down sadly. "And the Duke?" Eleanor was silent for a few seconds. She'd never met Alexander, only heard stories about him being fair, disliking idle talk, respecting ordinary people, never humiliating servants, and once personally saving a child from a burning carriage. She didn't know if it was true, but she really wanted to believe it. "I'm not afraid of him seeing my face," she said quietly. "I'm afraid he already believes everything they say about me." 3 days before the wedding, fate decided to intervene in the most unexpected way. Alexander was returning on horseback through the forest after a meeting with the steward. The sky was quickly darkening. A thunderstorm was beginning. Suddenly, a frightened woman's scream was heard ahead. The horse broke off the road. The carriage tilted dangerously over the ravine. Without a second thought, the Duke spurred his horse. The coachman desperately tried to keep it in the water. The frightened horses rushed forward. Another moment, and the carriage would have plunged down. Alexander managed to grab one of the horses by the bridle. The animal reared. The wheels slid on the wet ground. The carriage stopped literally a few centimeters from the edge. Someone inside was breathing heavily. The Duke quickly opened the door. A young servant girl ran out first. Following her, a tall girl in a dark blue traveling cloak cautiously appeared. Her face was completely hidden by a familiar white veil. "Are you injured?" Alexander asked. The stranger raised her head for a moment. Although he could not see her face, he was struck by her eyes for some reason. They were unusually calm, not at all like the eyes of a frightened person. "Not thanks to you?" Her voice was surprisingly soft, warm, without a trace of arrogance. She looked at the frightened horses. "You risked your own lives, Zerves. Anyone would have done the same." The girl smiled faintly. "Believe me," she said it almost in a whisper. "Not anyone." For some unknown reason, Alexander suddenly felt at ease near this stranger, as if they had known each other for a long time, as if something inexplicable had arisen between them, independent of names, titles, or faces hidden under the fabric. He wanted to ask who she was, but at that moment the maid hastily touched the girl's hand. "My lady, we cannot linger." The stranger seemed to remember something important. She made a slight bow. "Thank you, my lord. I hope." Her voice barely trembled. "Fate will allow us to meet again." The carriage slowly disappeared among the trees. Alexander watched it for a long moment. He didn't even notice that a small silver brooch in the shape of a snow lily lay on the wet ground at his feet, an ornament that had accidentally fallen from the mysterious girl's cloak and which, in just a few days, would change not only his life but the fate of all English high society. Alexander picked the silver brooch up from the ground so carefully, as if it were not a decoration but a fragile memory. Rainwater trickled down the petals of the snow lily, and in the very center a small blue sapphire shimmered. He couldn't help but smile. "It's strange," he said quietly. He was sure he had never seen this girl before, but the feeling that had arisen in a few short minutes of conversation did not leave him. In her voice there was neither feigned tenderness nor coquetry, which were so often used by society ladies. She spoke calmly, sincerely, as if she was accustomed to valuing actions above beautiful words. Returning to the palace, Alexander immediately handed the brooch to his butler. "Find out who this coat of arms belongs to." The elderly butler carefully examined the decoration and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "My Lord Snow Lily, do you know this symbol?" "Of course. It is an ancient family crest of the Winterfords. Only members of their line wear it." Alexander's heart sank for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." The Duke was silent for a few seconds. The girl under the white veil appeared before his eyes again. "Really?" No, this could not be. Could his future bride be that very stranger? But then why didn't she say anything? Why did she hide her name? He slowly squeezed the brooch in his palm. There were still no answers. At the same time, the Winterford carriage sped along the wet road. Margaret broke the silence. "Miley, you should have told him the truth." Eleanor looked out the window, watching the raindrops blur the reflection of the forest. "If he knew who I was, then he would speak to me differently. Perhaps better." She shook her head sadly. "Or worse." Margaret sighed heavily. "But he saved you. That is why I did not want this act to be associated with obligations." She touched her fingers to the clay. "Today he helped a stranger, not an heiress, not a future duchess, just a woman in trouble. And that was what was most precious to her." For the first time, a man looked not at her title, not at her wealth, and not even at her face. He saw a person. At this thought, her heart beat a little faster. In 2 days, all of London lived only for the upcoming wedding. The newspapers printed dozens of speculations. The most unhappy marriage of the year. The handsome Duke marries a woman no one dares show to the world. What does the mysterious heiress look like? At breakfast, Henry threw a fresh newspaper right in front of Alexander. They were already placing bets. On what? Some were sure the bride wouldn't take her hair off at all. Others thought the ceremony would be cancelled. Alexander indifferently pushed the newspaper aside. People always needed a spectacle. Henry looked at his friend carefully. "And you? What about me? Are you really not interested at all?" Alexander thought for a moment. It was before. But now, he slowly took a silver brooch out of his pocket. "Now I'm interested in something completely different." Henry immediately noticed the unusual expression on his face. "Will you tell me?" For the first time, Alexander told in detail about the incident in the forest, about the carriage, about the mysterious girl, about her calm, about the words she said before leaving. When the story was finished, Henry suddenly laughed. My friend, it seems that for the first time in your life you are thinking about a woman whose face you have never even seen. Alexander wanted to object, but realized that he could not. It was true. He really did remember her eyes, her voice, even a slight smile that he didn't see fully but somehow felt. And it frightened him more than any rumors. In the evening, Eleanor went out into the winter garden. It was the only place where she could be alone. White roses grew under a glass dome. Their scent always calmed her. She carefully touched one of the flowers. You're worried? She heard her father's familiar voice behind her. She turned around. Count Edmund of Winterford looked tired. Over the past few years there had been noticeably more sit-in in his hair. A little. He came closer. If you want, I will stop the wedding. Eleanor looked at her father for a long time, as if trying to understand if he was serious. Are you really ready to cancel the agreement with the crown? The Count nodded slowly. For your sake. Yes, but then, I don't care what the ministers, advisors, or aristocrats say. He took another step towards his daughter. I have taken too long to make decisions as a statesman. Today I speak as a father. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. A lump came over her, a lumpka. She rarely saw him like this. Usually the Count was a reserved, almost cold man, accustomed to hiding his feelings behind strict manners. But now an insignificant aristocrat stood before her. A man who was afraid of losing. The only person close to him stood before her. Father. He carefully took her hands. Answer honestly. If you don't want this marriage, we will leave before dawn. France, Italy, anywhere. Let all of London consider me a traitor. She smiled through her tears. You have taught me all my life not to run away. Sometimes you need to leave danger. But what if danger exists only in my fears? He looked closely into her eyes. Are you talking about the Duke? Eleanor looked down. I don't know him. But you think about him. She didn't answer. Silence said more than any words. Draft sighed heavily. What happened in the forest? The girl raised her head in surprise. Where are you from? Margaret told me everything. Eleanor was silent for a few seconds, then quietly said, He saved us. And he didn't ask my origin. He also didn't try to look under the veil. Father frowned slightly. And that surprised you? Yes. She smiled sadly. Everyone else wanted to see the face. He wanted to make sure I wasn't hurt. For the first time in a long time, the Earl smiled genuinely. So the rumors about his nobility weren't a lie? That same evening, Alexander was sitting in the library when his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Isabella of Ravenhall, entered the room. Despite her age, her posture remained impeccable. She could silence an entire council of lords with just a glance. You are unusually thoughtful today. Alexander stood up. Good evening, grandmother. She sat opposite him. I asked a question. He poured her tea. I'm just thinking about the wedding. Isabella watched her grandson closely. No. He looked at her in surprise. What? No. You're not thinking about the wedding, you're thinking about the woman. Alexander smiled faintly. Isn't that the same thing? The old Duchess shook her head. Not at all, no. She had lived a long life and understood people too well. When a man thinks about marriage, he becomes serious.